This part should be just renamed Paradino, because that is approximately 80% of the movie. Not that I'm complaining. This is the 80 minutes that have earned this film renown, and probably greatly weighed the scales in its favor at the Oscars, even with the help of today's digital embellishments. There is nothing that remotely comes close to the sheer grandeur put on display here. I guess communism was good for one thing after all. If you thought, like I did, that the representations of the battles of Schöngraben and Austerlitz in Part 1 were incomparable, then you're in for a treat. I feel confident in saying that there has never been a more impressive depiction of warfare put to film. Those 80 minutes are more than enough to cement Sergei Bondarchuk and the people who worked on the film as some of the greatest filmmakers of their generation. I had previously decried Part 1 for trying to do too many things in too little time. It would seem the makers of this film traveled forward in time to hear and heed my advice. Or, more likely, they realized the breakneck pace of Part 1 could not be sustained and kept the following parts more focused. One thing that also plays in the film's favor is the fact that the book itself gradually narrows down in scope as it progresses. What initially seems like a cast of far too many characters to keep track of is steadily reduced in size. People fall out of the story either through death or of old age, sickness, or war, or simply get married off and fall out of relevance, much like Boris Turbetskoy. After marrying a rich heiress, Boris is seldom heard of. His film counterpart, who was only featured in one scene in each of the first two parts, although the word featured is an overstatement when it comes to part 2, doesn't even get a mention in part 3, though we hear his name as his wife, Julie Trubetskaya, née Karagina, is mentioned. Napoleon's crossing of the Niemen is represented here with all its importance. Not only was this the happening that kick-started the most destructive war the Russian Empire had ever seen up to that point, an event which irreparably altered millions of lives and killed hundreds of thousands, but this was also the event which cemented the downfall of the First French Empire, although one can argue the invasion of Spain to have been the start of this calamitous chain reaction. The ruinous consequences of the Russian campaign of 1812 made Napoleon's destruction inevitable. The crossing of the Niemen is so important that, in the film, it is shown twice. Part 2 closes with it, and Part 3 opens with it. The camera is perched on top of a hill across the road from Napoleon and his generals. No doubt a few maréchals among them. But that is not what the camera is pointing at. Descending the hill, both fording and following the river, are two seemingly endless lines of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. History tells us that over 500,000 men accompanied Napoleon in his invasion of the Russian Empire. While it isn't really feasible to assemble that many men as extras for the production of a movie, the average person cannot conceive of how a crowd of 500,000 men would look. The average person can only look at the tens of thousands of extras in this shot and say, wow, that is a lot of people. Additionally, the Grande Armée didn't all cross the Niemen in the same spot. The invasion force was split into 5 columns which were spread out along the massive Russian border. Napoleon himself crossed near Kaunas in present-day Lithuania, whereas Marshal MacDonald crossed nearer to the Baltic at Tilsit, now Savietsk, in Russia's Kaliningrad Oblast, and attempted in vain to take Riga. The second column, with which Napoleon crossed, was itself spread over 20 kilometers. Furthermore, in this scene, we cannot see the back end of the column that is moving along and across the Niemen. Men are still pouring out from behind the camera. To sum it up, there were probably as many men in the film as there were at that particular crossing in 1812, if not more. Again, chapeau to Bandarchuk. As I said earlier, the Battle of Baradino makes up about 80% of the movie. However, that remaining 20% is nonetheless crucial. The second scene after the crossing is one where 15-year-old Petya Rastov announces his desire to join the army to his parents. He is far too young and eager for war, and his terrified parents try to dissuade him, but his childish zeal is indefatigable. Pierre, who is also present, knows all too well what could happen to this young man, as evidenced by his look of dread. But he also knows that Petya cannot be dissuaded, hence his aghast facial expression. At Bald Hills, life goes on as usual. The old Prince Balkonsky, a veteran of the invincible Alexander Suvorov's campaigns, is incapable of even imagining the French being a threat to the Russian nation, much less coming so close as to disturb his daily routine. When Princess Maria reads the letter from Andrei at dinner, the old man doesn't even listen. The news of the French being at Smolensk does not perturb him in the slightest. Not only is he unmoved, but he speaks of the French being defeated far away, claims which do not have any validity whatsoever. That night, though, Nikolai Balkonsky finds himself incapable of falling asleep. Something is gnawing at him. Andrei's letter. Upon reading it, the shock is so great that he suffers a stroke and passes away the next day, not before a touching scene where he thanks his daughter and asks her to forgive him. In the book, this plays out slightly differently. The morning after reading the letter, the old prince sets out to the nearby village to organize its defense. A few hours later, he is brought back home by soldiers after suffering said stroke. He also remains alive for many days until passing in the book. In the grand scheme of the story, this is a largely inconsequential change. On a character level, however, this bears some significance. Rather than being killed by the overexertion of trying to rally the militia and the common rabble for the defense of the countryside, Nikolai Andreevich Balkonsky was killed by the news of the French advance. Even if he was a stubborn old man, military retreats would have been no stranger to him. As an officer who had served under Suvorov, he should be well acquainted with the Generalissimo's strategic retreat through the Alps of 1799. This masterful strategic retreat saved the Russian army from being annihilated by the French Revolutionary Army. Surely, another retreat against the French should not sound so unimaginable to someone who has lived and fought one already. This fact would not be lost on the audience as well, as Suvorov is a national hero in Russia and his exploits are well known. That the old prince should die of news such as this makes it more incredulous, although it is but a minor quibble as far as the film goes. As I said earlier, the Battle of Baradino is the most impressive battle ever put to film. It is accurate in the sheer number of men marching together in unison, the multitude of cavalry charges, the tumbling of many a horse, the cannon fire, and the carnage. This will never be replicated. Narratively, however, it is very weak. We have no idea of what is going on. This is not a flaw unique to this film, as massive set pieces have a way of confusing the viewer. 1971's Romanian epic Michael the Brave comes to mind. It is, however, different here. The fortification manned by Prince Bagration's soldiers, the Fleches, were the main focus of the battle. A great number of men died defending and attacking half-finished earthworks. Yet they are seldom mentioned in War and Peace. This is incongruous with the rest of the story for a work which has been lauded for its great historical accuracy. Perhaps because it would undermine the main point of the accompanying commentary. Therein lies my biggest gripe with both the film and Tolstoy's story. The author posits that generals don't know the happenings of battles, that orders are useless, and that the denouement of engagements rests on the spirit of armies alone. While the spirit of the army sounds like a mythical force which has no bearing in the rational world, it can be reasonably equated with the morale of the troops. Morale has been the deciding factor in countless battles throughout history. It causes superior forces in terms of numbers, equipment, and training to break the ranks and flee. It makes or breaks military engagements. Be that as it may, Tolstoy mentions the spirit of the army, not morale, precisely because the spirit is supernatural. Historically speaking, there are countless examples of single-handed or near single-handed efforts which completely reverse the tide of a battle through morale. Routing armies are decisively reinvigorated by the image of one of their comrades or leaders persevering on, much like enemy morale can be broken by the sight of one man falling or one fearsome enemy. It was the image of the giant King Sancho VII of Navarra charging into enemy lines which broke the Moors and assured Christian victory at Las Navas de Tolosa, just like it was the sight of the decapitated head of King Władysław III which broke the Christian army and ensured Ottoman victory at Varna. These facts are, however, irreconcilable with Tolstoy's rejection of the great man theory. According to him, no one person can alter the course of a battle, hence why the spirit of the army is the one and only decisive force of a battle. Thus, in the heat of combat, the head of the army is useless. Generals do not know what is going on and cannot alter the course of the engagement as their orders are always erroneous. In short, they are completely impotent. To Tolstoy's credit, this theory is not devoid of merit. Coordinating hundreds of thousands of men on a battlefield that stretches over kilometers and is obscured by the smoke emanating from hundreds of cannons and thousands of firearms, is no simple task. Neither is relaying orders over such a distance in a timely manner. These impediments, while incredibly challenging, are not impossible to surmount, however. It is just as challenging for the enemy to execute a maneuver as it is to respond to it. Therein lies the importance of being attentive and anticipating their moves. For if maneuvers were useless, why wouldn't generals just hurl the totality of their armies at each other and let the spirit decide the outcome? Thus, for Tolstoy, Kutuzov was a genius for knowing that he could do nothing, and Napoleon a bumbling fool for vainly trying to alter the course of the encounter, according to our author at least. It is important to remember that Tolstoy wrote from a justifiably biased point of view. He himself was born 16 years and 2 days after the Battle of Borodino. His father and uncles took part in the Patriotic War of 1812, as it is known in Russia. Even to this day, Napoleon is taught in Russian schools as one of the great villains of the nation's history, with the likes of Subutai Khan and that famous Austrian painter. Napoleon's invasion devastated Tolstoy's country in a manner which can hardly be imagined by most people alive today. As such, in the novel, l'Empereur is portrayed as an incompetent, clueless, mean-spirited, egotistical, callous, irreligious, and irascible individual. Most of these character traits are also reflected here in part 3 of the film. Perhaps the most puzzling of the traits Tolstoy's Napoleon exhibits is his ridicule of religion. It only appears in the book when he is visited by Alexander's envoy. The former calls the people of Moscow superstitious for having so many churches. He mocks them. In reality, while not associating himself with any denomination, Napoleon was a Christian. Like the Russians, he believed in God, just like the people he was invading. This attitude from his part makes no sense. No doubt this characterization is a further attempt at making a less sympathetic figure, to demonize him if you will, hence to provide War and Peace with a more traditional villain. In one of the final scenes of part 3, Napoleon is seen standing alone, contemplating the countless lifeless bodies strewn across the battlefield, looking oblivious as to the fact that his decisions caused this devastation. This is further reinforced by the narration telling us that Napoleon was evil because he could not understand the breadth of his actions. He was incapable of holding himself responsible for what had just occurred. This is utter nonsense. Napoleon absolutely did not feel contempt for the lives of his men, and neither did he feel contempt for the enemy. Having risen from the ranks himself, he knew and empathized with the hardships his soldiers faced. He was not unable to understand the impacts of such grand battles, not only because that would be inhumane, but because that would be tremendously stupid, to disregard how such losses would affect his empire. L'Empereur was neither stupid nor inhumane. In fact, he later regarded Baradino as a loss. As for his tactical acumen, there are 3 scores of battles one can point to. There is not a more successful general in the history of the world. Yet, according to Tolstoy, those victories weren't due to the skill of Napoleon and his commanders. It was due to another mystical force. It was the movement of the peoples from west to east. This movement is described as pendulum-like by the author. It is a strong, inalienable force against which resistance is futile. But it is not infinite. It eventually loses steam and returns from whence it started. Much like how a pendulum eventually comes back no matter how hard one pushes it. This insurmountable force's eastward movement began with the French Revolution and ended with the taking of Moscow. Its return motion ended with Napoleon's abdication. This mythical force cannot be overcome, no matter how many armies you throw at it. Needless to say, this is a less than complete theory. I suspect the chief aim of crafting such a theory was to discredit Napoleon and to further eulogize Kutuzov as a hero of the Russian people. There is a certain humor in trying to celebrate a man by illustrating his idleness, but nevertheless, War and Peace is certainly very flattering towards the old field marshal. As for the rejection of the great man theory, I can find no more apt way to enunciate my feelings than this Thomas Carlyle quote. No sadder proof can be given by a man of his own littleness than disbelief in great men. Ironic that Tolstoy's greatest work is one that rejects the idea of individual greatness, especially considering the writer's immeasurable impact. Despite the film's slanderous attempt on Napoleon's character and the lack of cohesion during the battle, it is still a tremendous achievement, proof that sheer spectacle can be a substitute for story in the proper context. That, in itself, is an extraordinary accomplishment from the part of the filmmakers. Part 3 is a resounding success, especially when it comes to capturing Tolstoy's vision.